Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. Had an interesting week, especially last night. So this is the morning after, essentially, of a very, very interesting night. In fact, a very enjoyable night. Some time ago, I was invited by a woman called Karen Sander, who runs a program called Aging Fearlessly. Now, I was pretty intrigued by that because I thought, what a wonderful title to a program. Now, apparently Karen is on a serious mission to encourage people over 50 to be active and involved in the world around them in order to improve their quality of life and longevity. Now, I talk a lot about this in terms of specifically about men because, I've seen too many times when men have retired and within 12 months they're deceased. Some of them last physically longer, but, without being trite, mentally have checked out a while ago. So I was really keen to sort of get a sense of what she was doing. And the thing that she's really running at the moment is a thing called the Story Room. And the Story Room essentially invites speakers to present on a theme. Each speaker gets 8 minutes, so it's pretty tight. And she apparently stalked me, as she puts it, on the internet and asked if I would be interested in coming on board to give my 8-minute tale. Now, what she does with the evening, she has a particular theme running. And so the theme of this evening was turning points. Now, it grabbed my attention. I just couldn't help go, this is really interesting. Because, again, with my work with men and boys, is the issue about turning points often come up, but it's never quite... And I certainly, in some ways, have never really specifically looked at the dynamics with my client about turning points. It's sort of almost embedded. We don't even, in a sense, need to speak about it or address it concretely. And the reading Karen's website and looking at what she's doing, I thought, well, I might be missing something here. That this, in fact, could be a really valuable topic on the whole change process and inspiring change, because essentially Karen's mission is similar to mine in the sense that she, like me, is trying to encourage and inspire change in people. Do something different and, feel the fear and do it anyway, as a famous title of a book on dealing with anxiety says. Most of us are bound too tightly by our own fears and anxieties, and we tend to catastrophize those even further. So it's a bit like, being fearful but on steroids. So what I thought I'd do in this particular podcast is, in fact, share with you my fundamental turning point, what led me to do what I do. And, by all means, with Karen's work, please go to her website, agingfearlessly.com. Doesn't matter if you're overseas. This is the beauty of the internet, is that we can take on board material from all over the globe. And all of us have something to offer, and especially all of us have a story to tell. And, each time a client comes into my office, essentially my starting point with that person is their story. tell me what brings you here to see me. And then the other stuff is about what would you like to get out of it. But fundamentally, it is about their story and how they want to write the next chapter or chapters in their life. So really, very, very integral part. So let me share with you my story, which essentially begins in Vienna, Austria. Now, I literally grew up a few hundred metres away from Siegfried Freud's house, so I always found that quite ironic in a sense, prophetic. Well, who knows? Certainly my mother told me a lot about him, but also in the context that he was Jewish, and Jewish people were being persecuted in World War II and prior to that, and it was a shameful period in Austria's and Germany's history. But I also got the story from my mother about the fact that this was a brilliant man. So somehow this must have sunk into my subconscious, because I don't remember thinking about him in any serious capacity until much, much later. Now, I was a typical inner city kid. Vienna is a beautiful city. It is often voted one of the best cities in the world to live in. But one of the attractions to it is that it's absolutely steeped in history and culture. And, neither of my parents were too backward in coming forward in instilling in me, the social, historical and cultural legacy that was endowed in living in a place like Vienna. Yet somewhere along the way, my mum and dad had the idea that perhaps the grass is greener on the other side, and it so happened to be on the other side of the world. So in 1970, I found myself at the age of 12 sitting in an aeroplane and heading towards Australia. I was leaving school and getting transplanted in a completely different culture and landscape, as well as education system. Now, at the time, I didn't think about any of this too deeply. To me, it was just this fantastic adventure, and I was into adventures. I was this 11, 12-year-old boy who read deeply in the sort of adventure literature for boys and girls at the time. So fundamentally, the idea was, well, what could go wrong with a move like this? Well, there were a few things. One of the things I missed in my enthusiastic anticipation of this new and exciting venture in my life was at school I was learning French and Latin, not English. Australia is an English-speaking country. So this became particularly formative as I'm trying to get into school. And the way that it happened was that we arrived in Sydney on a warm, sunny July day. Our friends had a house overlooking Newport Beach in the Reef, and it was just stunning. And our first sort of meal together was a picnic on the beach, essentially. And despite being July, I thought it was nice and balmy and warm, and the water wasn't too bad. So I, in fact, had my first encounter with the ocean. And that was a great start. What happened next wasn't necessarily so encouraging, and that is that I spent this incomprehensible day in North Sydney being assessed for where I would fit into the academic niche in my new school. So a week later, apparently I did really, really well. They were happy despite the fact that I couldn't speak English. So my mum took me to the new school, and I was promptly placed into the top classes in Year 1, or what's now Year 7, basically. And, so let's go. All good so far? Yeah, not quite. Here I am, a German speaker with schoolboy French and Latin, but no English. More importantly, there was no learning support to learn English. There were no ESL classes. That is, English as a second language class. We have these in abundance now in the school system. So it was either sink or swim. fortunately, I had a knack for languages, and I had a German teacher who struggled with conversational German. In fact, it was so bad I could barely understand him. But we decided to help each other out. He was going to teach me English, and I was going to help him out with his conversational German. Now, within a very, very short time comparatively, and I had no reference points at this stage at all, I was fluent in English. But what I did, because I didn't want to sound like Arnie Schwarzenegger, I worked diligently on getting rid of any accent. And apparently I was quite successful. And as I'm doing that, I'm actually rising up in the classes. So I'm getting into academically more and more demanding environment. And, up to a point I was coping quite well. We're now in year 10, and suddenly I'm faced with a big question. What is it that you would like to do with the rest of your life? Now, I had no idea. But as in a lot of migrant families, there was this absolute expectation to head to university. It didn't really matter what I did at university, although my mother definitely had a bent on medicine, or potentially law. I don't think she ever thought of psychology at all. But I certainly didn't think about this at all, because there were really only three things that were of fundamental importance in my life in year 10. The first one was surfing, the second was music, and the third was girls. They occupied my mental space almost entirely. Now, surfing is a thing for me that is like genetic almost. It's just an environment that I can immerse myself, pardon the pun, and it's my therapy. Music, because I love it, and I was fortunate to be able to form a band with a couple of guys, and I played percussion, which suited me down to the ground because I hated reading music, and I could do this almost by feel. Now, we were doing well. We were doing gigs around Sydney, and we were getting right into the Sydney music scene. Well, the next concept was girls. Well, that wasn't too difficult either, because they came with surfing and music. And, as you can imagine, that doesn't leave necessarily a lot of mental or practical space for studying in my weekly schedule. My idea was that there was plenty of time to get enough classwork done to get through. Not necessarily brilliantly, but as long as I passed, didn't have a problem. But suddenly I was confronted by the HSC, and it dawned on me that I'd run out of time. The HSC was happening right here and now. There was no more, it'll be happening tomorrow or next year or whatever. It was on. And, after every exam, my mum would ask me, well, how did it go? And I would shrug my shoulders and reply, okay, sort of non-committal. Didn't display too much anxiety about it, didn't really want to give away too much. Anyway, she must have gotten wind of, the situation in a way where she said, look, I'll make a deal with you. You have till the end of January to find a job. And I went, okay, no problem, that's a while away. So I'd finished the exams, we're waiting on the results. I knew personally that there wasn't going to be any good results to get into uni, although I wasn't necessarily going to fess up to that right then and there. So I must have at the time been a bit of a slow learner. The summer was brilliant. It was really good with plenty of gigs and more girls and great surf. On the last day of January, I got up for my usual European breakfast, and beside my plate was a recruitment ad for the Bank of New South Wales. I looked at it, I was puzzled, and on the top in red were the words interview 9 a.m. Now, I knew there was no point arguing with my mother. She had made the decision. So anyway, I rolled into the interview. It went well. And the final question was, where do you see yourself in your career? Now, I thought, career? What career? I'm going for a job. But I was quick on my feet in that particular instance. So I said, well, I'm bilingual, good with languages, and I like to travel. I think foreign exchange is where I'd like to be. Now, here's the point. I had absolutely no idea what foreign exchange actually did, but it sounded good. It was a bit like, the Foreign Service, MI5, MI6, ASIO, whatever it was. It had a certain glamorous ring to it. The guy looked at me, smiled, and said, well, that can be arranged. And I sort of left with this little bit of optimism floating around in my head that this could actually be maybe something that could develop. A couple of weeks later, I found myself in a branch at Newport, and then a week later, I was transferred to Avalon, a local suburb, right across the beach. And this was like, okay, I've got a job, I'm getting paid, I've got great access to surf, and it's not far from home. Cool. What I didn't bank on was that in a very short period of time, I hated the job with a passion. But there was the promise of foreign exchange. And I waited, but there was no call about foreign exchange. So fast forward to a year and a half, and I'm fed up. And one morning, a friend of mine rings me and says, let's go for a surf on the south side, but I need to go to uni first for a compulsory introductory 2-hour lecture on psychology, and, and after that, we'll go for a surf. Now, by this stage, I was needing a serious mental health day, and although I hesitated at first because I didn't like just playing hooky, I ended up going, okay, I'm in. So, as we made our way across campus, having arrived at the university, I sort of got sucked into a bit of the buzz around the place. There was lots of young people, going here, there, everywhere, sitting on the lawns, lots of girls. There was a band playing or rehearsing in the corner. It was sort of like a little bit of a couple of guitars and someone playing bongos. It was the 70s. And so, it was cool. We got into the lecture hall, and within minutes of the lecture starting, my mate was asleep. However, on the other hand, I was captured by the environment and the topic. I suddenly knew what I wanted to do. And herein lies the problem. I didn't have an HSC. I didn't have the certificate that would get me into university with the right marks. And the other problem was I was too young to be a mature age student, which at the time was 26. And to me, at 19 and a bit, it seemed decades away, not a couple of years. So what to do? Well, after a few phone calls, because I wasn't going to be put off, I found that I had one option that would get me what I wanted. I had to redo 2 years of schooling in 1 year. Now, it was probably, in some ways, the most difficult academic year that I ever had, because it really meant working hard. But I had a fire in my belly, and I needed that to get through. Now, when I got the results, I was over the moon. I had hit my goal. Now, to round off the story, I've never looked back. It's been over 4 decades, and I'm as passionate about my work now as I ever was, and possibly more so, because I've expanded what I do. I'm no longer simply, that sounds bad, I'm not just working with people in counselling and therapy. I'm actually writing programs, I've written books, I've produced a documentary, an entree film for a documentary. I'm now writing a script. And, it's just a very fulfilling and exciting and challenging space that I've created for myself as a result of that one shift, that one point where I did something that was out of the ordinary. I took a sickie. The surfing was a no-brainer. I would have gone for a surf anyway at lunchtime across the road. But I decided to go with my mate. And it was the thing that turned a surf trip into a life trip. Now, again, we all have turning points. This happened to be the one that I cherish in a way the most. But I could give you a dozen just in that story. There are a number of turning points. And what I want to encourage all you listeners out there to do is to reflect on what turning points you've encountered and what you chose to do. Because one of the speakers raised a really important point at this juncture. She talked about, for a turning point, it needs to be an end and then a beginning, but there's something in between. And it's the question that always intrigues me is, what is it that we do with the in-between? Or is it simply just another continuum? Where do we head? What is it that we draw on to make those decisions about which way to go? Now, I know from my own life experience that intuition weighs in heavily at this point. I've had too many experiences where I've ignored my intuition and I've regretted it later. So I'm going to leave you with a challenge. I'm going to ask you to check in with yourself about the turning points. Because in the next podcast, I want to talk about community turning points. I want to talk about that idea of social change. How is it that we can identify critical turning points and critical pathways that stem from that? Where is it that we are going, and what direction, what values, what moralities do we need to work with in order to leave a legacy that leaves this planet better off than when we came into it? And at the moment, there are some really serious challenges going on in that space. So I hope you've enjoyed my little story. As I said, if you're interested in Karen's work, please go to agingfearlessly.com. I believe that there's recordings of the night, so if you're interested in that. But I just thought I'd give my audience, my subscribers, my listeners, the story that I wrote. Because when I speak, I often speak off script, so it's a little different. It's still the same theme, still the same, broad brush approach, but just that little bit different, a little bit more personalised. So until next time, take care of yourself, embrace change, and see what happens. Till later, it's me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at Noirtainment, NOIRTAINMENT.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.